My people, hello. We're looking at topic 4.4, section number 2. This is actually my second time recording this video. I recorded one like a week and a half ago, went to post it, and there's no audio to it. So here we go again. This just shows my level of dedication. Appreciate it. Drink it in, or just my level of stupidity, probably more likely. All right, let's get into it. So there are three tools to change the supply of money, and all three of these tools are held by the Federal Reserve, that 100% independent agency, central bank that regulates and manages everything in our banking system, and most importantly, from an economic sense, controls the supply of money. The first thing that they can do to change the supply of money is to buy bonds or sell bonds. Buy bonds or sell bonds. So the Federal Reserve holds the most bonds out of anybody in the United States, right? Or any entity in the United States. Think of it, every single one of those bonds that, or every single dollar of the US federal debt, that's a bond held by somebody. And the greatest holder of those bonds is the Federal Reserve. What this does is it gives them flexibility. You see, remember, excess reserves that banks hold, not the Fed, but the banks that are underneath the Fed, those excess reserves are potential loans. And so, as long as banks have those excess reserves, they can give out loans to people, and that generates an increase in the supply of money. So, if the Federal Reserve wants to decrease the amount of loanable funds on the market and therefore decrease the supply of money, all they would have to do is sell bonds to those banks. So, instead, with those excess reserves, instead of them lending it out, they buy a bond from the Fed. When they buy a bond from the Fed, it goes on their spreadsheet. They make money off of it. They're happy, but they are not giving out loans. They buy bonds instead. So, when the Federal Reserve sells bonds, it shrinks the supply of money because banks have less to give out. Vice versa. Banks all over the United States have a lot of bonds on their asset side of their balance sheet, as we just talked about in class the other day. So they have those there. What the Fed can do, because they don't have to make a profit, in fact, they're designed to take on a loss. What they're going to do is sell the bond, or I'm sorry, buy the bonds from those banks at an unheard of price, right? Where the banks would be stupid to turn it down. And so the banks will sell their bonds to the Fed. The Fed will buy bonds from the bank. So we're doing this from the Fed perspective. When they do that, money goes into the reserves, right? And now there are more loanable funds in the bank balance sheet. That's the logic behind it. So the buying and selling of bonds is the number one tool that the Federal Reserve uses to manipulate the supply of money, change the interest rate, which changes investment and consumption, which impacts aggregate demand, which fixes recessionary and inflationary gaps. So, in the event that the Federal Reserve wants to expand the supply of money, they buy bonds from banks. Buy big is the easiest way to remember this. Buy big. If they buy, it increases the supply of money because banks all over the United States have bonds currently on the books. The Federal Reserve gives them a bunch of money, takes the bonds away, buys the bonds from them, and the excess reserves of all these banks goes up in the amount of bonds they sold to the Fed. And now they have more loanable funds. And vice versa, selling bonds is contractionary. You sell, shrinking the supply of money. So we say sell small. When the Federal Reserve wants to shrink it, they sell bonds at a great price to the banks where they're going to make a ton of profit off of it. The banks are gladly going to buy the bonds from the Fed. So when the Fed sells those bonds, they have less, the banks in the United States have fewer excess reserves, and as a result, fewer potential loans, and so less of an impact on the supply of money. Okay, so let's check it out here. We've got our assets on the left here. We got our liabilities and owner's equity on the right. The Federal Reserve buys $9,000 of bonds from banks. What's going to happen? Well, get my handy dandy marker here. What's going to happen is this bank here is going to sell those bonds to the Fed. So they get rid of those. And now they have $0 worth of bonds in their reserves. What did they get in exchange for those bonds? Well, they got $9,000. So excess reserves are going to go up by those $9,000. So it's going to be $11,700. Notice, because the Federal Reserve bought bonds, buying bonds, they increase excess reserves for the banks, and they'll do this for all the banks in America, which increases the loanable funds. And we know when banks give out loans, poof, money is created and the supply of money increases, right? So excess reserves will rise, there will be more loans that will be given out, and therefore there will eventually be more money in circulation. Got it? Great. Let's keep going. Let's say the opposite is true. The Federal Reserve comes in and they sell bonds to the banks. So they come to the banks and say, hey, there's a great interest rate on this bond. We're going to sell it to you at an incredible price. Buy these bonds. So the banks would be idiots to pass it up because the Federal Reserve is like the mafia, right? They give you an offer you can't refuse. So here's how this works. When this bank sells or buys the bonds from the Fed, because the Fed is selling the bonds, so this bank would be buying the bond. When they do that, they use their excess reserves. Remember, excess reserves can be lent out, but they can also use them for anything, like buying bonds from the Federal Reserve. So their excess reserves go down to zero. They get $2,700 more bonds, so $11,700, and that's where they plan on making their profit, not from the loans that they're giving out. But notice what's happened here. Our excess reserves have fallen, which means this bank can't give out any loans in this situation. And every bank across America is experiencing the same things. There are fewer loanable funds because of what the Federal Reserve did when they sold bonds to the banks. And so there's less money in circulation, and that decreases the supply of money. Okay, now, all of that is true. And yes, it will have a multiplied impact. But the biggest thing you need to know, and probably most important, is when the Fed buys bonds, it increases supply of money. When the Fed sells bonds, it decreases the supply of money. Buy big, sell small. If you keep that in mind, you'll get about 80% of the questions about bonds and the Federal Reserve correct. I know, it's crazy. Okay, let's keep going. They have other tools to change the supply of money as well. That was just one, the buying and selling bonds. Tool number two is increasing and decreasing the reserve ratio. Remember, the reserve ratio is the amount of money that banks have to set aside as required by federal law, and that law is set by the Federal Reserve or the central bank. So the central bank, they increase the reserve ratio, it means more money has to be set aside. So required reserves are going up. But remember, they can't lend out those required reserves, which means excess reserves, are necessarily shrinking. If excess reserves are going down, there are fewer loanable funds. The supply of money will not increase at the same rate. So that contracts or decreases the supply of money. There are fewer excess reserves to lend. And vice versa. If they decrease the reserve ratio, then there's going to be more excess reserves. Banks have more loanable funds. Banks are more likely to lend those and increase the supply of money. So a decrease in the reserve ratio increases excess reserves, decreases required reserves, and gives us more money to lend, has expansionary effect, and increases the supply of money. In other words, there's an inverse relationship between the reserve ratio and the supply of money. Tool number three. This is increasing and decreasing the discount rate. Remember, one of the things the Federal Reserve holds as a role is they're the lender of last resort. So what banks sometimes do, actually often do, is they'll borrow from the Federal Reserve at the discount rate, that's the interest rate you pay the Fed, and then they will lend to people like you and me at a higher rate, and they'll make profit. So they just borrow from the Fed, who has an unlimited amount of funds, and then they sell to people like you and me, or lend the bonds to people like you and me at a higher interest, and the difference is their profitability. Now, that interest rate that they pay the Federal Reserve is called the discount rate, right? They get a discount from borrowing from the Fed. If the Federal Reserve decides to increase that discount rate, then that transaction we just talked about is less profitable. When I borrow from the Fed, I have to pay them a higher interest rate. So then when I sell it or lend it to people, I have to charge them an even higher interest rate, or I charge them the same interest rate. Either way, it's more difficult. My profitability falls. And so banks are less likely to borrow from the Fed. And vice versa. If they decrease this, it's more likely that more banks will just borrow from the Fed instead of trying to generate new deposits, borrow from the Fed, pay them an interest rate, and then lend to people like you and me at a higher interest rate. And so banks pay a lower rate, it's going to result in more loans, which results in an increase in the supply of money. Okay, if you're a person that likes step-by-step instructions, here you go. When there's an increase or decrease in demand deposits, when people deposit money in the bank or take money out, here are the steps. And we talked about this a little bit in our emphasis. First of all, remember there's no change in the supply of money. It's just a change in the composition of M1. Both checkable or demand deposits and cash are M1. So when somebody takes cash and deposits in the bank, No initial change in the supply of money. It's only when banks lend money out that the supply of money changes. So first you calculate the required reserves, which is your deposits times your reserve ratio. Then you calculate your excess reserves, which is simply their total or actual reserves minus your required reserves. And then you calculate potential impact, which is your change in excess reserves times your money multiplier. Or if you're clever and they aren't asking you the change in excess or required reserves, just in the total impact on the supply of money, you can simply take your checkable deposits and multiply it by your money multiplier minus 1. Okay, so if you want to write that down and you didn't write it down in our emphasis lecture, it's there for you. What about increasing and decreasing bonds? Well, first, the initial change in supply of money is immediate. It's different than the change of a deposit, where it's just a composition of M1. When the Federal Reserve buys bonds from banks, they immediately inject new excess reserves that didn't exist before, right? They used to be in the Fed, now they're in the banking system. In the Fed, it's a black hole. It's not a part of the system. Anything in the Fed is not in the system. So when they inject it into the banks by buying bonds from them and giving them excess reserves, those banks have an immediate increase in the supply of money, which is whatever the size of the bond is. So if the Federal Reserve buys $5,000 of bonds, the initial increase in supply money will be $5,000. So it directly increases or decreases the excess reserves. Then you simply calculate the potential impact. All of the money from selling a bond to the Federal Reserve or all of the money from buying a bond to the Federal Reserve comes out of excess reserves. Remember, that's what the Fed is doing. They're manipulating the balance of excess reserves. Deposits aren't changing, right? This isn't a deposit. The Fed is not putting a deposit in the bank. Deposits don't change. What changes are excess reserves and our bonds, right? And both of those are on the asset side. So every single bit of the purchase of a bond is going to go into excess reserves, or selling of a bond will go into excess reserves. So you just take your excess reserves times your money multiplier. Finally, increase or decrease in the reserve ratio. You have to recalculate the multiplier. First things first, whenever there's a change in the reserve ratio, the multiplier is going to change as well. So that's 1 over the reserve ratio. Then you do the before and after. So you take your excess reserves times your old multiplier, and you take your excess reserves times your new multiplier, and then you look at the difference, right? So if I had $100 of excess reserves, and my old multiplier was 4, well, my old impact was $400. Now I have the same excess reserves, $100, but my new multiplier is 10. Well, now I'm at $1,000. So the difference is 1,000 minus 400, or $600. So that's the difference between those two impacts. This is rare. Most of the time you're calculating the change in deposits. Every once in a while you do a change in bonds, and just remember it's the same amount. If the Fed buys $5,000 of bonds, your excess reserves are going to change by $5,000. So you just take that amount and multiply it by the multiplier. Okay, final thing. If banks dip below required reserves, which happens sometimes, what do they do to get out of it? They can A, borrow from another bank. Other banks have excess reserves, right, at different balances. And so banks mess it up, or somebody claims their loan, or something happens where they don't have their required reserves. They're out of compliance with federal law. They can just borrow from another bank's excess reserves, and we call those overnight loans, and they pay a rate called the federal funds rate. So they're borrowing funds from other people, they pay the federal funds rate. The second thing they can do is just borrow from the Federal Reserve. They're like, oops, sorry, we're out of compliance. Can we please borrow from you at interest? And the interest rate they pay the Federal Reserve, as we referred to earlier, is the discount rate. So those are the two options banks have. You just need to know that definitionally. Sometimes they'll have you do a bank balance sheet, and then they'll say, hey, excess reserves required reserves are too low. What can this bank do? And you got two options for what you write in there. Okay, that's it for 4.4. Go ahead and take that college or that Khan Academy, and then we'll have a College Board and emphasis lecture in class tomorrow. Peace.